evening. It's great to have you here. My name is Alda. My name is Kevin Pendergast, and I have the privilege and the thrill to be headmaster of the Kildonan School. And the thrill, a lot of it, comes from working with a unique, dynamic, creative mind that is the dyslexic mind. And the reason, one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here tonight and to be a part of this is that all of us at Kildonan make the latest research into the neuroscience of dyslexia, into the talents of the dyslexic mind. We make that our work every day, studying it and putting it into practice. And tonight is a unique and special moment in which all of us from Kildonan and I and elsewhere are going to get a crash course in the latest up-to-date information about that very topic, the dyslexic mind, dyslexic talents. 18 years ago when I started tutoring and teaching at the Kildonan School, my first tutoring student on my first day was a kid who was also in my dorm. So I had talked to him a bit the day before and knew that he was interested in aeronautics, in NASA, and in space travel. And so I prepared a lesson late that night that I thought he would be interested, connected to that topic. And I thought that would be a good way to break the ice with him the next day, tutoring our first session together. And so that first period, the first day, I went in, and to open up the conversation, I said to him, Eric, tell me a little bit of what you know. This is a 14-year-old. Tell me a little bit of what you know about NASA and astronauts. And I thought it would be a couple minutes. And out of this kid's mouth came 20 minutes of graduate school level knowledge about jet propulsion, about how much fuel you need in order to get up into the stratosphere, about why the rockets have to then detach from the space shuttle. He wasn't just talking about famous astronauts, he was talking about obscure ones as well. And I thought, my gosh, I didn't know what I was getting into here. And so I then put before him a paragraph that talked in print a bit about NASA. And I thought at first, I hope I don't insult him, because this is at such a low level, and he is at such a high level of knowledge. And he looked, and he couldn't read the word NASA. And then I dictated to him in spelling words like NASA and other basic words related to this topic. And he didn't know how to write them. He was pretty far from knowing how to spell them. And that night, my mom called me anxious about my first day and my first real job and asked me how it went. And I said, Mom, I have someone who is a genius when it comes to knowledge about aeronautics, and yet he can't spell or read the most basic words connected to it. And she said, this sounds like it's going to be a very difficult job. And I said, it will be a difficult job, but it will be, Mom, an inspiring job. And I've never met a mind that is so fascinating. And 18 years later, I am still fascinated by it. And I and the rest of you are going to learn so much about it tonight. And at any time, any of you want to come to, oh, that's okay. I think you all can hear me, right?
Kevin, we need it for the video.
Oh, okay, thanks. So anytime any of you want to come to the Kildonan School, it's only 15 minutes away. You want to see this cutting-edge research in practice, whether it's in our one-of-a-kind, one-on-one work, dealing, and tutoring, whether it's the training you'll see in our Assistive Technology Center, whether it's what you'll witness in our independent project program, which has turned the traditional classroom on its head, whether it is in our college-level art program, where you'll really see dyslexia talent in full force. You're always welcome there. You can go to www.kildonan.org to schedule a visit. We'd love to give you a tour. I'm also excited to be here tonight because we're sharing this event with an organization, a group of people everyone at Kildonan has such admiration for, and that is I. And it is a thrill to share the stage with my friend David Flink, partly because I and David in August, the Kildonan senior here, taking photos, who just got into group reunion. These folks brought I to the Kildonan campus, and I is a national grassroots mentoring organization for students with learning differences. And because of the work of August and David and I, dozens of students at our school have more confidence than ever, have more awareness about their dyslexia, and have more pride in it. So thank you, David.
Right on, thank you. That will make my job so easy. I don't have to explain what eye to eye is. I don't have to really thank you all, although I do thank you tremendously for coming. So I'm just going to share with you a quick story. When I was 16 years old, I had the privilege of going to school in Philadelphia. So I had Morton Gillingham training. I had some great role models. I remember my parents used to say, you know, you're going to be fine, you're going to be fine. And I would say, well, you know, I appreciate that, but I don't know one person who's dyslexic or ADHD who's just a little older than me that could be a mentor. And that's what we do at I. We give young kids mentors who have the exact same learning difference. But I was getting through school, and I bet many of the parents here, you know, have a kid like that who's in their teenage years getting through school, probably with a lot of support. And where things got to be a challenge for me was science. And I'll tell you why. It wasn't the material. I actually loved the material. But those words, even if you had some great phonemic awareness, like I was still dyslexic. So I would get to these novel words and I just couldn't read them. And so in much of my reading, I was able to get through it, but I couldn't get those books into my head. And finally, my report card comes home, and I'm scared, right? Like, it's sitting at the dinner table. You've been at that dinner table. And, you know, I'm like, I know I did well in most of my classes, but I know I got a C in my science class. And so my pops opens it up, and he's looking at it, and he's like, what's with the C? I'm like, what about, you know, the A in every other class? He's, well, what's with the C? I said, well, look, I was waiting to get those books on tape, and I'm dyslexic, and, you know, tape, you young kids don't know what a tape is. It's like an iPod. But I hadn't figured out a way to get the knowledge in my head, and my dad and I get into a little tough the way that, you know, teenagers do with their fathers, and I just, you know, storm upstairs. And now my dad, undiagnosed ADHD, a similarity in our family, impulsive, runs upstairs after me, but in an amazing moment, pauses. And he comes into my room, and instead of just like continuing the argument, he says, well, how can I help? How can you help? Well, I'm first thinking, can you show me like a 19-year-old who's dyslexic and gotten through this? Like, that would help. But that person I didn't know, right? That's what we do at I. But that person I didn't know. And I say, well, can you read this to me? That's the problem. Can you read this to me? And I think I said something like, can you read this to me, old man? or something. And again, uncharacteristic ADHD. He says, right now? And I'm like, well, no, I got other things to do. And he says, well, and how about, you know, I grab your book and I read into that little micro tape recorder that you have on your desk. Again, micro tape recorder is like a big tape, smaller. It's like an iPod. Forget it. It's like an iPod. And he goes in the other room and he starts reading his science to me. Now, luckily, he's not dyslexic. He's just ADHD. So he's pacing back and forth as he's reading. And he used to be a radio announcer. So he had this like great reading voice, and he was like, today chlorophyll is blah, 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 you know. And I can hear this through like our paper-thin walls in our home. And he comes back like an hour later, and he just takes the tape and gently like puts it on my desk and leaves. And he grabs another one, and before long, over the course of a couple of weeks, he's read all of my science into these little tapes, which I now listen to and end up doing very well in science, right? There we go. So why did I tell you the story? Well, Two reasons. The first is, as parents here, like that little bag of tapes that I still own is just a bag of love. And all of you parents here, I know, have that for your kids. That's why you're here tonight. The second reason is my dad did for me what Mr. Alda is going to do for us tonight. He was quite literally able to translate this science that I needed into my brain in a way that I learned best. Now, we are just so lucky, and I think we all know it, to have Mr. Alda with us. Not only a very celebrated actor of stage and screen, an incredible author, the co-founder of the Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook. He just comes with us with so many different talents. And so tonight, I hope you will help me in welcoming this tremendous man who's giving us this gift of translating with an incredible, world-renowned panel of experts on dyslexia, what we need to know right now about the most cutting-edge research in dyslexia. Mr. Alda, if I can welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. you. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Getting feedback.
Oh, we're getting feedback? Yo, okay, I hear myself coming back. So this is great. It's so terrific to see all you folks gathered here on this topic tonight, because the reason I feel that way is I have a personal connection to this. I have two, actually. My daughter works with Dave Flink at Eye to Eye. She works very closely with Eye to Eye. And her daughter, my granddaughter, is dyslexic and goes to Kildonan and has been transformed by her time at Kildonan. She was very shy when she went there. Didn't really poke her head up in a crowd, but was very witty, and if only she would have expressed that wit, she would have knocked everybody out in the room, but she kept to herself a lot. But at Kildonan, she was taught to advocate for herself, stick up for herself, express what she needed. And she's been transformed. She's a star now. It's great. So the people who are helping make that kind of progress happen, that kind of understanding that Dave was talking about, to become a reality and to affect in a positive way the people who are dyslexic. Those people are going to come out and talk with us tonight, leading experts in the field. And it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Let me just bring them out, and then I'll tell you a little more about them. They're going to be Dr. Brock and Heidi and Dr. Fernette Heidi, Dr. Manuel Casanova, and Dr. Fumiko Heft. Please come out, folks. Join us. Thank you. Let me, now we're getting feedback from one another. No, I think we're okay. Let me introduce you to the folks on the panel. Doctors Brock and Fernette Heidi, I'll talk about together because they're collaborators. They're neuroscientists who wrote a best-selling book called The Dyslexic Advantage, which outlines the mind strengths and talents of dyslexic individuals. They run a successful neuro-learning clinic in Seattle, Washington, in that area. And in addition to running their clinic, they speak internationally about the gifts and talents of dyslexic individuals. On my right is Dr. Fumiko Heft, research scientist at UC San Francisco. Dr. Heft earned an MD, PhD in 2003, and focuses her research on the dyslexic individual using functional and structural magnetic resonance imaging to see what the brains of bright dyslexic individuals look like. I've been in a lot of those fMRIs on the science show. I don't know how you do that to people. It's like being stuffed in a culvert, you know. She uses this. Do children like it? I know.
Did you want to come back?
Yeah. But you give them a few pills first? Okay, now you're talking. Now you're talking. She uses this information to inform education of dyslexic children. Thank goodness for that. Dr. Manuel Casanova is a research scientist from the University of Louisville in Kentucky. Dr. Casanova is board certified in 3 disciplines relating to the brain, and his research focuses on the neuroscience behind the dyslexic brain. Welcome to you all. Please welcome them all. So I think it would be a good idea to talk about, in the most general way, many people in the audience, I'm sure, are familiar with what dyslexia is, and many of us need to know more about it. I know I do. 50 years ago, I first heard about dyslexia, and I heard about it as simply mixing letters up. That's what I thought the whole story was. But it's not it, is it? Tell us about it. How would you describe it in a basic way?
Well, dyslexia is really a wiring difference that's associated with some challenges in reading and writing and spelling, but also associated with a lot of advantages in conceptual thinking, spatial problem solving, and many other kinds of things.
So even in terms of you're not having some of the same abilities as a person who's typically wired. those differences are varied, aren't they? I mean, it's not just to separate it from the advantages for a minute. What some of us might call disadvantages are more than just mixing letters up, right? For instance, I know that my granddaughter sometimes sees the letters fall off the page, but it's not just...
It's not just a visual thing, no. Often it's difficulty discriminating sounds in the phonological part, but sometimes it can also be with naming things. It's harder to do that, and processing speed, and automatizing different kinds of things. So that's what makes writing often more difficult than typing.
And how about telling a story? Is that a problem sometimes?
Well, it depends. I mean, sometimes there are people with dyslexia who may have difficulty, for instance, after an experience, if you say, tell me what you did, it may be hard to organize what they want to say in that sense. On the other hand, there's some wonderfully talented storytellers who are dyslexic. Sometimes if it comes out of their imagination, and it's very different, using different pathways. So there's some dyslexic storytellers, very famous, who are quite fluid with words or fluid with pictures, like filmmakers.
Yeah, but for instance, Dave told an amusing, interesting, coherent story when you came out. I had a little trouble following it. But... No, but I mean, and you're dyslexic, so storytelling is no problem. Did you have to learn it?
You know, it's interesting. I grew up in a barbershop. My grandfather's a barber. And if you live in a barbershop your whole life, you learn that storytelling really matters. And so I think with my challenges, and I think they can speak to the science why this is true, with my challenges with reading, storytelling became something different. And I think it was probably activating a different part of my brain. I love telling stories, so I had training in it.
Yeah, that's...
From when I was 12, or maybe younger.
But, Brock, you both have focused not on dyslexia as a deficit, but as an advantage, and with many advantages. What are some of the advantages?
Well, in our book, we talked about what we call the mind strengths. And so we broke advantage patterns down into 4 basic categories. M we called material reasoning. It basically means spatial reasoning in 3 dimensions. So being able to think about...
What is it, spatial reasoning? I mean, I can see in 3 dimensions, but how do I reason in 3 dimensions?
So it would be things like being able to conceptualize a physical object in 3 dimensions, rotate it in your mind, be able to move around it. A lot of designers, a lot of architects, engineers, people in construction trades will describe being able to actually hold something in their mind and either manipulate it so they can see, imagine what it would look like from above, a spatial view, never having seen it from above, but just having seen it from the sides, or be able to hold it in place and imagine walking around the other side of it, or maybe visit a construction site. We had a very successful developer up in Vancouver, Canada, who described his ability to visit a construction site and say exactly what a property would look like on that particular lot, and walk through all the rooms, be able to look out the windows and floors that hadn't been built yet and see what the view would look like. So he was building on hills looking out over Vancouver Sound, and he could imagine what he would be seeing if he were 3 floors up.
And this is not a fluke. This is a product of the way the brain is organized.
That's right.
When you're at that end of the spectrum.
That's right. So the brain organizational pattern, and we've been really heavily influenced in this by Manuel Casanova's work. One of the trade-offs that we see, so the standard way of conceptualizing what's going on in dyslexia is thinking about it from the perspective, as you mentioned, of disability. So thinking, here's a brain, here individuals are having difficulty reading. What's wrong with their brain? How can we fix it? But when we really started looking carefully at dyslexic individuals and families, we found that they had patterns of weakness or patterns of difficulty or patterns of challenge, but they also had patterns of strength. And the interesting thing when we began to look into the neuroscience is that we found that the explanations for some of the wiring patterns that created the challenges also predisposed to strengths. And one of the most interesting things that we found was that there appears to be a structural trade-off in the way that the brain neurons, the cells that process information, are organized that gives dyslexic abilities advantages in mental processes that involve sharing information between widely different parts of the brain. So linking different areas together in complex ways that allow you to see relationships or connections, view things in 3 dimensions, see whole patterns rather than just individual pieces of them. But at the same time, the structure that gives you the strength in that area also makes it harder to do certain kinds of fine detail skills, like see things that are very closely spaced together, like letters on a page in small print, or to hear sounds that are very closely related to each other, like the M sound or the N sound or the th sound. And that trade-off between skill in these big picture patterns and these fine detail skills that goes a long way in explaining a lot of the practical problems that we see in individuals with dyslexia. Right. But it also explains many of the strengths.
So before we get to Manuel to go into more detail about what you were just describing about the way the brain is organized that leads to these advantages, for instance, that dyslexic person had a special talent not shared by a lot of the population for architecture and building. What are some other talents that have emerged? I mean, we've heard of Branson, who is apparently very dyslexic and is a multi-billionaire and runs a big corporation. Charles Schwab, the same thing.
That's right.
What are some of the other talents that might emerge that we might be surprised to hear about?
Yeah, the eye strength stands for interconnected reasoning. It's basically the ability to make connections and see relationships between things. So to spot patterns, to view ideas or objects from different perspectives, to apply talents and perspectives that you've gained working in different occupations in different ways on the same thing. So a very flexible mind. End strength is narrative ability. So it's the ability to take pieces of your past experience, break them apart, and recombine them in different ways to essentially tell a story. And that's important in being able to remember experience, but it's also important in being able to imagine new possibilities. D stands for dynamic reasoning, which is basically taking that ability and using it to project into the future to make predictions or to make predictions about the remote past. So in terms of an entrepreneur like a Branson or a Schwab, you're trying to look at financial markets, you're trying to look at business conditions and say, you know, what if I did this? Based on my experience, I would predict that would happen. Or what could go wrong? We had the CEO at Party City this weekend at a conference we were organizing in Norwalk say, when I go to organize a new business, the first question I ask myself is, what can go wrong? And he was very good at predicting where the breakdown
He can come
occur.
up with things that might go wrong that somebody else thinking in a more step-by-step process.
That's right, absolutely.
Would not come up with. Huh?
So he's looking toward the future, and at the same time we had Jack Horner, a famous paleontologist who was there, uses the same skills to project into the remote past and say, you know, what the social life of this dinosaur was based on these bones in the ground.
And he's dyslexic.
He's very dyslexic. He flunked out of the University of Montana 7 times, never earned a degree, and is now a professor at Montana State University.
That's amazing. That's great, huh? So, Manuel, tell us a little bit about what there is going on in the brain that allows for this tremendous set of positive advantages that can take place in a brain that we would have called in deficit a few years ago.
Well, there are many things that are happening. First of all, the brain is divided into 2 main compartments. The outside is called the gray matter, and that's where many of the cells and cell bodies actually lie. And then you have an inner compartment, which is made by the projections of those cells, and we call the white matter. And what we have found is that there is a distribution, a blueprint of connectivity within the brain that is dictated by a ratio of short to long connections.
So, do I have this right from the brain scientists I've talked to? When I was a kid, they used to say, use your gray matter. Because they hadn't, I don't think they'd studied the white matter yet, and they weren't paying much attention to it. But the white matter, as I understand it, is in a way the cabling between the different parts of the brain that are gray, right? And without those connections, you can't do much.
Yes, many people actually believe that the intelligence of a system is within its connectivity. So we have the elements, and then we have the connectivity, which actually goes through the white matter. And some connections are actually short, and they go from one gyri to the next immediately adjacent gyri. And some other connections actually travel a little bit longer. They go and connect different parts of the brain and actually the different hemispheres. And it's this ratio of short to long connections that may dictate how a patient thinks and reacts to different stimuli, and it actually defines its capacity to actually solve problems.
So let me just make sure I got you. These, what I'm calling cables, is that what you call columns?
No.
No, something else. But, okay, but is it the length of those connectors that you're concerned with?
Right now, yes.
Uh-huh.
So we have some that are very short connections, some that are very long connections. And we have seen that within the population as a whole, there is a distribution of those short to long connections. At one far end of the spectrum, we see people where there's an overabundance of short connections at the expense of longer connections. And then at the other tail end of that distribution, it's completely the opposite. You have individuals that have very long connections at the expense of shorter ones. And that difference in terms of connectivity relates to how a person thinks, what we actually define as a cognitive style. People that have an overabundance of short connections at the expense of longer ones, they tend to be very concrete in terms of their thinking. They actually see a tree and they lose the forest, okay? Those people tend to have an autistic-like cognitive style. At the other end of the spectrum, we have completely the opposite. We have the people that have a lot of long connections at the expense of shorter ones. For those people, actually making inferences out of remote insights is actually very easy. You can actually have them think about a problem in regards to religion, and they may watch a show about astrophysics and get ideas to solve the same. They are the absent-minded professors. They are the people that actually see the forest, but they don't see the tree. And those are the dyslexic types.
So there's this ability to see patterns and to put disparate things together. Huh? That sounds like you'd find among dyslexic a lot of innovative, creative people.
That's absolutely right.
Yep.
Yes.
So that's another advantage, huh?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
What you were saying, when somebody goes into a new job, they might do the job differently. A dyslexic person might invent a new way to do the job that everybody else has been doing in the same old way.
That's right. Yeah.
Also, you described, we were talking a few minutes ago, and you described something I thought was really interesting about if you change the person with the short connectors, as I understand it, in the brain. And then what's interesting about this is that we're just talking about the way the brain is structured, and it's not necessarily a deficit, and you're not. None of you up here seems to be identifying dyslexia as a set of deficits, but as a structure in the brain that has real advantages. It's not rhetorical. It's not selling somebody on an idea. These are real advantages you've identified, and you seem to be pinpointing where those people can shine and not be held back because they're stereotyped by what we would call deficits, what we have been calling deficits. Yeah. But you were talking about the people who have a routine, and I guess on the autistic end of the spectrum, the people with the shortest connectors need to be routinized, right? They really thrive on doing the same thing the same way.
That's right.
That's true.
If I can add something, the people that fall into the end of the spectrum where they have many short connections at the expense of longer ones, they can actually do functions of the brain quite well as they relate to particular areas of the same. So they are great at finding Waldo within a picture.
To find where Waldo is.
Right, because they have very good visual perception, and the only thing that they would need to use would be like the occipital cortex. But if you ask them to actually do something that requires language or any other task that requires putting together different parts of the brain and making them act together.
This is great. I'm beginning to get this, so I'm really excited. It sounds, now correct me, it sounds like you're saying that when they have these long connectors, by virtue of being long, they're able to pass through and connect different parts of the brain that can come into play in solving a problem or doing anything. Is that right? So that really makes a lot. There's the structure of the brain really is valuable to see it as a structural question.
That's right.
Because this thing of seeing the trees and not seeing the forest, where you're focused on details and you only do one thing at a time, you only focus on Waldo, but not see the whole. They might not even be aware that Waldo's at a theme park, but they can find Waldo. Whereas the dyslexics might first notice that it's a theme park and take a while to find Waldo. But that's because that connector is going through parts of the brain, and more parts of the brain are available to the, so they can see patterns in the whole picture and get innovative ideas, because they can see the value of different things. They light up at different things and how they can come together. My granddaughter has a great sense of humor. Is this partly, is it all me, or is it?
Well, there are some, there are a lot of famous comedians actually who are dyslexic, like Jay Leno and, and
Jay Leno, I forgot that.
Yeah, and
Goldberg.
yeah, exactly right.
Who?
Yeah.
Whoopi Goldberg would be another.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And some of that may be the wiring where when there can be kind of right hemisphere dominance in dyslexic people, and when a functional MRI scientists like Fumiko study things like humor and just like the essence of things, a lot of times that's in the right hemisphere. It requires a little flexibility of thinking. You can take words different ways. You can see, things that are, sort of clashes in expectation, and that's something that's often a right hemispheric strength that you can see.
Have you been studying? I didn't know that. Have you been studying humor in dyslexics?
No, that would be a great topic to study. We have not studied it. We have our center. When I was at Stanford, until last year I was at a university called Stanford, and at our center we were studying the developmental process of humor processing, and it was like that, and it seemed to be in some gender differences as well, but there was a more right hemisphere lateralization in general in humor, or kind of gist and those kind of processes.
You have a very specific, tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing that's most fascinating to you.
Let's see. So we specialize in studying younger children. We study in particular children. Well, we study a lot of things, but one of the things I'm passionate about is to study children at an early stage. So you might have a parent, we have a lot of kindergarten children before they start to learn to read, and they come in if they have a family history or a parent with dyslexia or a sibling with a diagnosis of dyslexia, but they don't know yet because they're not reading yet and they're at the beginning of kindergarten. We scan those children and try to understand them, understand the chicken or egg story. So if you have, is it because you have to practice on reading and going through all these interventions that makes you more resilient and develop all these kind of special connections, or do we see it even before they start learning to read? And so that's one of the things that we try to study. We try to apply mathematical algorithms, fancy algorithms to like machine learning or some things that you might use for artificial intelligence, and try to create models to try to see if a child will, the likelihood of a child of how well they will be doing later on. And one of the things that we focus on is not just on risk factors, but what makes them more resilient. Because some children, might have a parent with dyslexia or a sibling with dyslexia, but they go on and not develop dyslexia. And so we try to look for these resilient factors or protective factors as well, and look at their brains and see what makes them more resilient, which might help us understand how we can interact with these children who are at risk early on.
When you were talking a second ago about is it having to process things that leads to something, you raised a question in my mind. When I heard about Branson and Charles Schwab, and I think it's true that there's a higher percentage of dyslexics among successful business entrepreneurs than among the rest of the population. Is that right?
That's right.
By how much?
2.5 to 3-fold, and that's been proved both in the United States.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Impressive.
3 times as many dyslexics among successful business people as among the rest of the population. And there are other areas, too, where that's true.
Yeah, there haven't been a lot of studies in the United States, but in the UK, they've looked at incident studies in schools and training programs, and they found for engineers about 2.5-fold excess as well. Art and design students as well, similar kinds of numbers.
Yeah, there's no question that when you talk about the advantages of the dyslexic mind, you're talking about big advantages, big areas where it's really pronounced.
That's right. You know, I think there's a couple important kind of context things as well. Number one, I think when Manny was talking about the different brain structures and the functions, and we mentioned fine detail and big picture, that you know, both people on the autism spectrum and dyslexic individuals should be understood as having specialized brains. So there's a very important interaction between the environment, and I think this is a big part of the problem that we see in school. Characteristics that should be allowed to flourish and lead to strengths if they're nurtured properly become disabilities in environments where the kids are asked to do things in ways or at ages, times of their development, that they're not ready. So we're creating disability out of difference. The second thing that's very important to think about is when we're talking about autism spectrum folks here and dyslexic folks here, what we're really talking about is not autism spectrum or dyslexia spectrum, but the human spectrum. And when we think about entrepreneurs like Richard Branson and Chuck Schwab, you know, these are folks that are surrounded by people that they brought into their businesses to help them with some of these fine detail skills. So they bring in people that are more competent at other things. And the research into entrepreneurship does show this much higher rate of entrepreneurship among dyslexics. But that same research also shows that one of the skills that the successful entrepreneurs have is the ability to build teams among people that have different skills. So I think one of the things that we really need to be much, much better about than we have been is thinking about the context of relationships, that we're not just raising students to become islands, you know, without thinking about them in relationship to the other people around them. But we need to think in our dyslexic schools and raising our dyslexic kids about teaching them how to recognize what they're really good at, what they often need help at, and recognizing how to advocate for themselves and be good advocates for what they're good at, and also building teams with people who may lack those high
So we need not only good connections within the brain, we need good connections among people.
That's
right.
exactly
Yes,
right.
yes.
That was pretty good what I just said.
You might be dyslexic, yeah.
So Fumiko, what I was thinking of, what I was going to ask you, was when we have so much success among, say, just take entrepreneurs, it sounded like you were raising the question of whether, that your research might be exploring the question of whether or not that success is because they're tried so often, they're put under pressure so often and have to solve so many problems, partly by the way people react to them, partly by the problems they're given without any help, that they in a way toughen up to the difficulties of entrepreneurship? Or is it some natural advantage that comes to you through dyslexia itself? Am I asking it right?
Yes, and I think it comes from both. So the simple answer is it comes from both. So for example, I'll give you an example of one of the research that we've done fairly recently is on the topic of stealth dyslexia, which is a term that the ID's termed.
You came up with the term stealth dyslexia, and you explored it, but tell us what it is.
So would you like to explain, or do you want?
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, yeah.
So stealth dyslexia is where you have dyslexic-like characteristics, so you have trouble reading and the other usual characteristics, but despite poor reading, you have average or superior ability to comprehend. So when I was studying children, what I noticed was when I was interacting with children, I would have them read passages and they would stumble over each word after word after word, and then after a paragraph I would ask these questions about the paragraph, and some children were just amazing answering these questions, and I was just absolutely blown away. You would think that if they can't read, then they might use all their resources on reading and they might not be able to comprehend. And so
Yeah, so yeah, it's a difference between oral reading accuracy and reading comprehension.
So you can, that sounds like an anomaly. How can you have good comprehension if you had trouble reading it in the first place?
Yeah,
but this is from your own reading of the text? You get better comprehension?
Well, I think this is another perfect example of the difference between the fine detail and the big picture processing. So these are students that when they try to identify individual words, they're quite inaccurate. But what we see, it's like the students don't definitely settle with surety on an individual word identification. It's as if they put up a sticky note. So they may say truck instead of trick, but they'll put a sticky note up there that says truck may be trick. And if they get further along in the passage and they see something that may look like magician, then they'll go back later and they'll pull off the sticky that says truck, and now that goes back to trick. So at the end of it, they've taken and used all the large contextual information, the context. They've been able to infer the gist or essence of the passage, and that's where the comprehension comes from.
So is it possible that pardon me?
I want to talk about our brain results too.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask so I understand this part. Is the effort to put these are virtual sticky notes, mental sticky notes. Right. The effort to put those sticky notes up there and understand the individual word, is that effort making them more able to see the whole picture and get better comprehension altogether, or do they just have a better ability to get comprehension?
So we think it's a little bit of both, and so what we see in these children is when we look at their brain scans, what's amazing that we see this really strong signal or increased gray matter in the region called temporal pole, which is the temporal, which is the side of the brain, but it's at the very tip. And this region has been traditionally known as this top-down, contextual, higher-level language sort of region. And so it makes perfect sense that you use these kind of contextual sort of information to try to possibly interpreting the brain results. It seems like they're using those, they have abundance in those patches of the gray matter that allows them to understand the context and use that information to kind of comprehend despite having poor reading. And when you look at the age effects, so we wanted to see if it's a chicken or egg, and we don't have really young children for this study, but what we did was looked at the age effects, and we see both. So they see from a very young age, as young as we have data on, we see a difference between self-dyslexic and other comparison groups. But also it increases with age, meaning that you can train it. Also, it's there from the beginning in certain types of people, but you can also possibly train it where it develops over time.
Now, you're talking about training the comprehension or training the...
It's comprehension, contextual processing.
Right. Go ahead. No, go ahead, please. No.
I get excited when I talk about it.
No, that's good. That's great. That's wonderful.
The interesting thing is that we saw it bilaterally, and this is to complete speculation, so please don't go around quoting me on this, but it's the right, we see it not just the left temporal pole, but on the right temporal pole, and the right temporal pole is traditionally known, if you look at lesion patients and other things, that it's very important for social context. So comprehension of not the linguistic context, but the more of the social context. And so people who have lesion in that region cannot understand the social cues and context. So I thought that was very interesting, and we haven't really explored it and see if there's any behavioral differences in these children, but it is very likely that there might be differences in the social context, contextual processing as well.
So that suggests to me that dyslexics might have some talents in social areas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definite empathy. Yeah, exactly right.
This is so interesting to me because a question that I have, this is probably unrelated, but it's innovative.
We're going to get that diagnosis.
You might be part of that club.
You'll be the judge of that, I guess. I've noticed, and I've made recordings to compare them, the difference between somebody reading from a text and talking spontaneously. And when they speak spontaneously, they're much more social. The tone of voice is social, is recognizable as social communication. When they read, they go dead, the voice goes dead. And I'm just wondering if the different parts of the brain you're talking about. Later, let's talk and you can do some more research on my own. You can come up with an answer to my question.
The interesting thing, though, I'm sorry, this is not my research, but I'm
Yeah.
going to say one thing. The very interesting thing is, Fernette talked about the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, and we talk about these temporoparietal regions that you may have heard of that may not be functioning as efficiently in children with dyslexia or individuals with dyslexia. If you take the other side, it's famously known for, and some other frontal parts of the brain, for the mirror neuron system, a theory of mind, empathy regions. If you look at this occipital region, the back and the bottom of the brain, that's really important for visual word form area. It's called the visual word form area, the occipital temporal area right here, sitting on the bottom. If you look at the exact other opposite side on the right side, it's important for face processing. And so there's a lot of very interesting things to think about in terms of left hemisphere, right hemisphere compensation, and so on. So it's just really fascinating to think about these things.
Manuel and I were talking an hour ago at dinner about something I wanted to ask you about, which completely escapes my mind right now. The what?
Many columns, the columnar.
No, we talked. Yeah, we did. We've talked about the columns, haven't we? Or have we? No. Well, tell about the columns. So if I thought we talked about them, then we probably didn't.
Well, before we actually focused on the white matter of the brain, and we left out the gray. But all of the connectivity of the white matter actually comes from cell bodies located within the gray matter. And what happens is that cells are arranged together within modules within the gray matter. And you can think of these arrangements as a microprocessor. You know that within a computer you have one or two microprocessors, and that's where all of the information is actually processed within your desktop computer. The brain has like 100 million of those. It has like 700 million of those microprocessors, which are called mini columns.
Mini columns.
And they're called...
Are they literally columns?
They are cells and their projections that have a vertical orientation. And because of that, we call them columnar. And because of their dimensions in terms of microscopy, because they are so small, we call them mini columns. But the main thing is that they are the microprocessors of the brain. That's where the information that comes to the brain is actually processed, okay? And what we have found is that in patients with dyslexia, the mini columns are bigger than in comparison to normal individuals.
Bigger, not necessarily longer, but wider. Is that what you mean?
Wider.
Wider.
Meaning that their circuitry has actually changed in one way or another. But also, these microprocessors, these mini columns, in normal individuals, they have a certain variability in terms of size. So you have some bigger mini columns followed by some smaller mini columns. In the brain of the patient with dyslexia, this variability goes to an extreme. Okay, you have an enormous variability. And the way that we actually interpret the finding is that everything from the environment goes through relay stations within the brain towards the cortex. But they do not end in a pinpoint area. They actually go to large areas of the brain. If all of the mini columns were the same, they all had the same circuitry, okay? And stimuli going into these large regions would go and be processed through the same circuitry and provide the same output. So there's very little in terms of output. The brains would be hardwired if all of the outputs were the same. And that's what actually happens in the case of the brains of autistic individuals. In the dyslexic brain, okay, that variability actually confers an advantage because the same stimuli coming in provides for multiple opportunities to answer to a particular environmental exigency.
Now, is that because the column goes down through various layers of the brain and comes in contact with different cells that can be stimulated.
Yes.
Performing different functions because of different, so that the bigger the column is, the more variety it can experience in stimulating or being stimulated by other parts of the brain. Whereas when it's small, it's in contact with fewer parts of the brain that give it a smaller sense of variety. Huh?
Right, and I would say that was part of the discussion that we initiated some time ago in regards to short and long connections, because at one end of the spectrum, okay, in terms of connectivity, we have brains that have supernumerary short connections at the expense of long connections. Those brains also have small mini columns, and they lack in terms of variability,
right,
in terms of size of mini columns. Again, those would be the prototype of the brains of autistic individuals. At the other side of the spectrum, you have brains where connectivity excels in terms of longer connections at the expense of shorter ones, but then the mini columns, the microprocessors, are fairly larger, and they exhibit a lot of variability in comparison to one another.
Fumiko, this brings to mind something that you were talking about a minute ago, when you were talking about catching it, observing it at an early age, and comparing that to later ages. When I talk to brain scientists, I hear constantly about the plasticity of the brain, that if you lose function in one part of the brain, other parts of the brain that were originally designed for other functions can take over some of those functions. Not with the same ability, and they lose some of the ability that they were designed for, but the brain, it seems to be constantly changing, constantly in motion. So that makes me wonder, when I hear that dyslexia can't be cured, and I hear you talking about looking at it at an early stage, are there things that can be done at an early stage that can minimize some of what we call, or what most of us think of as deficits, and still hang on to most of the talents? Or is there another way you have to deal with it? Why are you looking at the early ages?
Why are we looking at the early ages?
Does it have anything to do with what I just asked you about?
Yes, I agree. I'm not sure. I'm happy to answer, but I feel like it might be a better answered by Robert.
Yeah. I mean, there's a very definite advantage to looking for earlier screening. So this is a very nuanced question. There's not a simple answer, and I think a big part of the policy problems that we have is that the solutions are often presented as simple answers. Now, it's unquestionably clear that early identification and early training with a multisensory phonics program, or for some kids a more top-down memory-based phonics program, is a good thing, and you can avoid a lot of challenges that otherwise you'd face in school. So we're totally in favor with that. There is much more variability in the response to that kind of program, though, than sometimes the advocates make it look. And we have to remember also that we're talking about brain-wide differences. So by remediating reading, we're not going to change all the differences in the brain. One thing that's important to remember is, even though dyslexia, the definition that you read in the book, focuses entirely on reading issues, when you look at a large number of people who meet qualifications for dyslexia, they don't show just reading differences. They characteristically show differences in working memory and processing speed on their IQ tests. They characteristically have difficulties learning how to write, learning how to do their times tables and their math facts quickly.
And numbers, math.
Yeah, that's a short connection things.
That's the most common pattern. And just working early on phonics is not going to change all of that. So it's very important to understand that thinking about environment, thinking about self-advocacy, thinking about teaming with others, thinking about modifying the educational system so we're not creating unnecessary disability, but we're nurturing strengths as well. All these things are important. So the solution's a big picture thing. very important to work for the advocacy piece, for the early identification, because that's moving us in the right direction, but it's not the whole solution. We need to think bigger.
Yeah.
So what's your prescription for education? How can education bring the best out of all of us, regardless of how our brain is organized?
Can I answer that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a two-handed approach where you're actually cultivating the strengths at the same time you're working to remediate these pathways. I mean, it's really understanding, the whole picture of dyslexic minds. And so, for example, when Fumiko found this extra gray area among the stealth dyslexics in the area of contextual processing, if you train up the discrimination, like our daughter who has mild dyslexia, she had trouble hearing P's and B's, and so it was back instead of backpack. So we trained up that BP transition, but that didn't affect her, great contextual knowledge. I mean, those extra grays still there. You see what I mean? These are all different pathways.
So you didn't give anything up on the advantages.
Don't think so. And that's how it is. There are all these pathways in the brain, and so the more specifically you can identify what the nature of the challenge is, then that's the way education should go.
Can I also add something?
Yes.
I mean, dyslexia is a developmental condition, and the sooner you intervene, the better for the kid and for everybody involved. But education has actually failed the kids, and by trying to normalize them and to try to provide remedies for their weaknesses, we have stigmatized the patients and actually made them feel worse. By actually taking a new approach and a different perspective. Thomas S. Kuhn said that science actually advances in terms of a paradigm shift, a different perspective at looking at an old problem. And well, we know that the previous paradigm for education in terms of dyslexia was providing stagnant results, confused individuals, and overall a lot of frustration. By actually playing to the strength of the individual, they are actually happier. And it's like a self-rewarding system. If we play to their strength in the brain, it's actually self-rewarding for the individual. And you know what? They actually start doing better with their weaknesses.
This is that's what I wanted you to say at dinner. That's what I remembered you saying at dinner, and I wanted to get back to it. It was so interesting to me because I hear you saying that if you acknowledge their strengths, develop them, and reward them for their strengths, even the weaknesses start to improve.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And you also have something interesting in your work in terms of the value, not just the values that accrue to dyslexia, but the values that accrue to society because of dyslexic people. Mm-hmm. When you talk about your notions of the evolution of our species and why there seems to be a place among humans for dyslexia, that's very interesting.
We have done a lot of studies in regards to mini columns and connectivity among different species, and we can draw conclusions in regards to evolution. And what we're suggesting is that this whole distribution in terms of connectivity has been preserved along with the tail ends and where dyslexic individuals actually fall, because they are of some use to society as a whole. And I think that Brock can actually add a statement made by Norman Geschwin many years ago in this regards, because
you know that what he's talking about?
Yeah, Norman Geschwin was a neurologist who worked on dyslexia about 30 years ago, and he made the general observation, which is true in medicine, that when an apparently disadvantageous trait is preserved in the population at a large prevalence, there is almost always some countervailing advantage to it that hasn't been recognized. And an example that he used was sickle cell trait, which many people know gives protection against malaria. So in its extreme form, sickle cell disease causes the disease condition that we know is sickling but the gene is preserved in the population because of the advantage it gives in preventing malaria in a very large percentage of the population. And Geschman speculated that the reason that so many people are dyslexic is that there is some functional advantage to having a brain that operates that way. And it's, one of the things that really was remarkable to us when we started working in this field is that it had rarely ever been asked, not what was wrong with the dyslexic brain, but what was the dyslexic brain for? It's a simple shift in perspective, but once you look at this brain from that different perspective, it appears in a whole different light and makes so much sense of the fact that we could have a conference this weekend filled with dyslexic individuals who were CEOs and entrepreneurs and artists and professors and scientists and the most interesting people you could imagine. We had Academy Award winners and Pulitzer Prize winners and MacArthur Genius Fellows. Many of them didn't finish school. All of them struggled.
How can you get dyslexia? It sounds really good. No, it's just wonderful. I mean, that you're identifying the value of this and not denying people the chance to grow into their most powerful strengths.
Yes.
Because you focus them only on what you don't think that they're doing well enough.
Yeah.
And it would be good if everybody could read equally well. But it would be also awfully good if we didn't lose the innovative and creative people that we might lose if we insist first that they have to be able to read the way we want them to before we'll let them grow into innovators.
Absolutely. Well, David Kelly, the head of the design school at Stanford and the co-founder, the man who invented the mouse that was used in the first Apple computer that used a mouse, the Macintosh, told us recently that he has many students that come to him that on the basis of their portfolio he would love to admit to the graduate student because they'd be the most creative people. And he can't do it because their scores on the entry-level tests are not high enough to pass through admissions. The irony of this is that David Kelly is himself dyslexic. And when we brought him a courtesy copy of our book, and he said, I've read fewer than 5 of these things in my whole life, but I really like the title. That appeals to me. So.
And so